Thank you for standing by and welcome to Kazia's Paxalisib Interim Data Investor Conference Call. All participants are in a listen-only mode. There will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session. If you wish to ask a question, you will need to press the star key followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. I would now like to hand the conference over to Dr. James Garner, CEO. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rebecca. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm James Garner. I'm the CEO of Kazia Therapeutics, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this investor conference call. The purpose of the call is to discuss our recent release of interim data from our ongoing phase 2 clinical trial of Paxalisib, formerly GDC-84, in glioblastoma. Now, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes making some introductory comments and remarks, and then we'll throw open to questions. We do have a large number of participants on the call today, so we'll try to take as many questions as possible and take them approximately in sequence, but I will ask your understanding if it does take us a few minutes to get to your question. To begin with, I wanted to briefly recapitulate some background for those on the call who have come to the story more recently. Kazia has been developing Paxalisib since licensing the molecule from Genentech in late 2016. Our lead indication for the program is glioblastoma, the most common and the most aggressive form of primary brain cancer. Paxalisib is an inhibitor of the PI3K pathway, a common target in the treatment of many forms of cancer. And the distinguishing feature of Paxalisib is the ability to cross the so-called blood-brain barrier, which ordinarily blocks the majority of cancer drugs and represents perhaps the most significant challenge in the treatment of brain cancer. Paxalisib is unique among its class of drugs in this respect. Kazia commenced recruitment to a phase 2 clinical trial of Paxalisib in September 2018. The overall purpose of the study was to reorient the program from the very advanced late-stage patients that were studied in Genentech's original phase 1 to a newly diagnosed population, which we believe is more suitable for treatment. We are specifically targeting the 2/3 of patients who will not respond to temozolomide, the only current FDA-approved therapy for newly diagnosed patients, and therefore the standard of care in this disease. The genetic marker for these patients is sometimes referred to as an unmethylated MGMT promoter. So you will sometimes see these patients described as newly diagnosed unmethylated or variants thereof. Essentially, these are patients who receive no clinical benefit from temozolomide. And as I say, that represents approximately 2/3 of the total patient population. Our study is structured in 2 parts. Part A is a dose optimization cohort designed to determine the appropriate dosing for this specific group of patients. This part ultimately recruited 9 patients between September 2018 and May 2019. Part B is a dose expansion cohort intended to seek preliminary signals of clinical efficacy. And this part recruited 21 patients between June 2019 and February 2020. In November 2019, we announced interim data from Part A, i.e. the first 9 patients in the study. And this interim analysis showed a median progression-free survival, or PFS, of 8.4 months. This means that half the patients experienced regrowth of their tumor in less than 8.4 months and half take longer. Now, for comparison, the median PFS associated with temozolomide, the existing standard of care, is 5.3 months. Now, that comparison is never perfectly like to like, but the magnitude of difference in this case provided real confidence that Paxalisib may be delaying tumor growth. The new data we've released this week builds on this very promising result in 2 respects. First, we've recalculated the PFS figure for the entire study population, i.e. all 30 patients. And it's very reassuring that the resultant figure remains quite constant and in fact shows a slight increase to 8.5 months. This gives us a much greater degree of confidence in the potential clinical efficacy of the drug. Clearly, the larger number of patients in the analysis, the more confidence we have in the data. More importantly, however, we have been able for the first time in the development of this drug to present initial overall survival data. And of course, overall survival, or OS, is the gold standard for assessing the efficacy of a new cancer drug. Put simply, it measures the ability of a drug to extend the life of cancer patients. A number of FDA-approved cancer therapies have never shown an OS benefit. But for those that do, it's considered a very, very strong validation of a pharmaceutical product. Our interim analysis for OS was conducted again on Part A of the study, the first 9 patients in the study. So in that sense, it corresponds to the PFS data that we presented in November 2019. And we determined an overall survival of 17.7 months, which compares extremely favorably to the published figure of 12.7 months that is associated with temozolomide in this patient population. Now, these are interim analyses, and approximately half the patients remain ongoing at the time of data cutoff. So we will continue to monitor the study through to completion, and both the PFS and OS figures may evolve further as the data set matures. In terms of next steps, we do anticipate a further interim readout in the second half of calendar 2020, followed by final data from this study in the first half of calendar 2021. In parallel, as we announced in December of 2019, Kazia has set up work on GBM Agile, our planned pivotal study for registration. This work is ongoing, and we continue to work towards commencement of enrollment in the second half of calendar 2020. I would remind you as well that we also have 4 other studies ongoing in other forms of brain cancer. These are more exploratory in nature, but we anticipate initial readouts from several of these studies during the remainder of calendar 2020. Finally, you will be aware that we have completed an institutional placement in the last day or so, which has raised $7.2 million of funding before costs. Those funds will, of course, be applied to progressing the company's pipeline well into calendar 2021, and the financing puts us in a very strong position to maintain momentum in the context of what are at present unpredictable capital markets. So with those remarks, I will now open the floor to questions and look forward to discussing these further with you.
Thank you. If you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. If you wish to cancel your request, please press star 2. If you are on a speakerphone, please pick up the handset to ask your question. Your first question comes from Joseph Mona from JCM Capital. Please go ahead.
Hi, I have a multi-part question, if you'd indulge me. Would you help me understand why you decided to announce the capital raise simultaneously with the data readout rather than let the market value the phase 2 data and thus be able to get a much higher price in the share placement?
Sure, Joseph, thank
you. And then
you.
I'll let you answer that.
Thank you, no problem. Look, I think we've obviously considered financing activities very carefully here, and among other things in the context of this data, I think we've got to recognize that raising money in April 2020 is a very, very different game than raising money in February 2020. And I think our primary concern here has been one of risk management. At the moment, capital markets are open. And at the moment, we have a number of interested investors that have been keen to become a part of the company's story. We have no visibility as to how that's going to play out over coming weeks, let alone coming months. And I think in that context, we thought it was sensible to take advantage of the investor interest while it was available. I think right now anybody who pretends they can predict market is very brave indeed. And so our priority has been to make sure the company remains well financed through this period.
Okay. Is management participating in the capital raise as I believe you did last time?
Sorry, Joseph, I missed the question there. Can you repeat?
Are you or the management participating in the capital raise? I believe you did in the prior one last year.
Yes. So we haven't participated in the institutional placement, but there is a share purchase plan that has been launched for retail investors in the company, for eligible retail investors. That gives those investors the opportunity to subscribe for new shares in the company on the same terms as the institutional placement, and all of the directors will be participating in that, including myself. We're all existing shareholders, and we all intend to participate.
Okay, great. And finally, any update on discussions regarding the Cantrixil asset?
Yes, we've said that we plan to release new data from the Cantrixil program before the end of April. As with the Paxalisib data that we've presented, both of these were intended to be presented at the AACR conference at the end of April. And of course, the AACR conference has, for practical purposes, been cancelled, but we've determined to release the data anyway. The Paxalisib data was available earlier. We're still working on the Cantrixil data, but we do expect to say something about that before the end of April.
Okay, great. Thank you, James.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Dennis Hume from Taylor Collison. Please go ahead.
Good morning, James. Thanks for taking my question. I was just wanting to clarify, what's the starting point for the overall survival calculation that you've reported? Is it the date of diagnosis, or is it from the start of the temozolomide chemoradiotherapy, as was reported in the Heggie paper you're comparing to?
Yeah, Dennis, that's a very good question, and thank you. So as we did with the analysis last November, we've started from the date of diagnosis. We spent a lot of time discussing this with the clinicians and the statisticians, and this seemed to be the most stable anchor point, if you like, from which to base the analysis. Now, you're right that is a very subtly different approach from the Heggie paper, where they essentially begin it from randomization, which is somewhere between surgery and initiation of chemoradiotherapy. Now, what does that difference amount to in practice? The trouble is that the period of surgery, which is effectively the difference, is different for every patient. Some patients are in surgery within several days of diagnosis and recover quickly. Some patients, it's a little longer. So there's no systematic adjustment for this. But in general, for most patients, it's of the order of several weeks. So I think we could say that as a very crude rule of thumb average, there's a difference of several weeks between our data and that in the Heggie paper. But there certainly isn't a difference of 5 months.
Okay, fair enough. And secondly, just looking forward to your participation in the GBM Agile trial, what do you expect the cost of your contribution to this study is likely to be over the whole period of the GBM Agile trial?
Jenna, so that's still under negotiation. So I'm afraid I can't give you a definitive answer to that. And generally speaking, we don't put out project-by-project costs in common with most companies. I can say that we expect it to be very materially less expensive than doing a standalone company-sponsored phase 3 study. But we are still in negotiation with the Global Coalition for Adaptive Research, the body that runs GBM Agile. So at this stage, we don't have an exact committed figure.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And I guess just returning to my first question, for these patients, have you recorded the date of the start of the temozolomide chemoradiotherapy treatment for each of those patients?
Of course. No, we have the full medical history for these patients, so we can examine sort of all scenarios.
Yeah, I think it would be useful for investors if you were able to report that as well, given the comparison that's being made to the Heggie data. So that'll just something to keep in mind for the future. Okay, thanks very much. That's the end of my question.
Dennis, thank you. I just maybe kind of address the last point you made there, because it is a good one. I would say that such an analysis would probably be no more comparable, because the Heggie paper sort of based it from the time of randomization, which can be several weeks prior to the actual initiation of chemoradiotherapy. They didn't start the next day. So it sort of also introduces probably several weeks of error, but in the other direction, if that makes sense. So I think perhaps an average of the two would be the most illuminating approach.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you. Your next question is from John Hester from Bell Potter. Please go ahead.
Good morning, James. James, just talk two questions really. First of all, what's the end game here? Is it the idea to take this through to market yourselves, or are you intending to partner this at what opportunity? So that's the first question. Second question is, can you just provide a little bit more detail on your interactions with the FDA and perhaps discuss the endpoints for this upcoming phase 3 trial, and whether there's going to be any difference between them and the phase 2, or anything else, any other input the FDA may have given you over the course of the last few months?
Of course, John, thank you. So to take the first question first, I think our strategy has been for some time now to pursue a sort of two-track approach to the development of this asset. We've always said that our general corporate philosophy is not to become a commercial pharmaceutical company. In other words, not to be selling a commercial product on market. And therefore, the next step for this asset is to partner it to a larger company somewhere along the way. And we have really for some time now been having those discussions in the background, making sure that potential partners are aware of the asset, are aware of the data, are following the story. And we'll certainly be continuing to do that. I think with the data we now have in hand, I'm actually very much looking forward to revisiting some of those conversations straight after the Easter weekend. And so we'll continue to pursue those discussions. And at some stage before this becomes a commercial product, our hope and our expectation is to license it to a larger company. Now, exactly when that happens, I think, is something we're a little bit more open-minded about. So I think there's obviously a general calculus here for any company, which is that the earlier you license the asset, the less risk and cost you shoulder yourself. But equally, the less value you tend to return for it. You know, we know very well that an asset which is at the preclinical stage of development typically will roughly return its costs of development in a licensing transaction. But it doesn't make a great return. An asset which has very solid clinical data will often return a 10 to 15x multiple on its cost of development. So there's a balancing act here for every company in considering this, and we have that balancing act too. It's probably fair to say that in glioblastoma, in the disease area we're working in, just because this has been regarded as a difficult disease area, the burden of proof for a new drug is perhaps higher than it would be in other areas. And so we're likely to require perhaps later data than might be required in some other fields of cancer drug development. So I think what we've tried to do is we've tried to pursue those partnering opportunities, but also in parallel make sure that we can move the drug forward, build value in it independently, so that we aren't in a position of depending on a particular partnering transaction to build the value of the drug. So we'll be continuing to move it forward. The GBM Agile strategy is the cornerstone of our approach to doing that. But in parallel, we'll be keeping a very, very open discussion with partners. If and when we feel there's a deal on the table that represents good value for shareholders, we'll be very pleased to entertain that. I think, again, we've said that we only really have two golden rules for our partnering efforts. One is that we think this drug deserves to move forward and be made available to patients as quickly as possible, and we want to make sure that happens in a partnering transaction. And secondly, it needs to be good value for shareholders. To your second point around some of the regulatory aspects, I suppose, of the path forward here, as we've said, that the GBM Agile study is the next step for this drug. At this stage, we hope and expect to begin recruitment in the second half of this year. Now, GBM Agile is using overall survival as its primary endpoint. And our participation in GBM Agile, at least, will be focused on these newly diagnosed patients who are unresponsive to temozolomide, the so-called unmethylated MGMT promoter. So in that respect, this data is incredibly reassuring because it is the patient population exactly mimics the patient population in GBM Agile, and the endpoint, overall survival, is the primary endpoint of GBM Agile. So I think in our mind, this gives us a great deal of reassurance about our participation in GBM Agile. In terms finally of our FDA discussions here, I think that this is always work in progress. I think one of the things that FDA was very clear on when we first brought in the asset was that we were not in a position to go directly into a pivotal study in newly diagnosed patients. They wanted to see some activity at a smaller scale here to understand the applicability of the drug. I think the data we already have in hand is very useful and relevant in that sense. So for that reason, we're sort of moving GBM Agile forward in parallel to the ongoing phase 2 study. We're not waiting for the study to finish, have a gap, and then start work on GBM Agile. We're sort of overlapping them a little bit. It really is a reflection of our confidence. One of the great things about GBM Agile is that the study is already operational, and it is strongly supported by FDA. So a lot of the questions that would ordinarily occur at this stage for drug's development one of the questions that ordinarily occur at this stage of a drug's development is around the ability of the company to get a study design that FDA will buy into and support. And really all those questions are effectively answered already by GBM Agile.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, John. No problem.
Thank you. Your next question is from Rebecca Harding from Twinings Asset Management. Please go ahead.
Hi, James. Yes, I was just wondering if you've seen any new safety signals in this study.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So the safety experience here has been very consistent with our previous experience with the drug. We really see three main toxicities. We see oral mucositis, mouth ulcers in plain English. We see an increase in blood sugar, hyperglycemia. And for a few patients, we see a rash. And those are really absolutely typical side effects of drugs that target the PI3K pathway. We see these with other drugs in our class. They're completely unsurprising. They're all completely reversible as well. So we can, for example, treat the mouth ulcers with steroid mouthwashes. We can treat the hyperglycemia with anti-diabetic drugs. But those are the main side effects we see of the drug. And that's been consistent all the way through the clinical experience. We haven't really seen any significant evidence of any new toxicities emerging with the drug. And our clinical experience at this stage numbers approximately 120 patients. So we're at a stage in the drug's development where we're starting to get some real confidence around the safety profile of the drug. I think once you get over about 100 patients, you start to feel that you're getting a handle on the safety profile, and I think it's been really very consistent for us. So I think we're certainly getting a degree of comfort here with the safety.
Okay, thank you. I just have another question, James. With this raising, have you now got enough funds to cover Agile, or will you need to go to market again?
Rebecca, I think that's a great question. So we are not fully funded through to the completion of GBM Agile, i.e. to the point where we would file for marketing authorization for the drug. Now, in terms of how we secure those funds, I think there's sort of multiple prongs to our approach. I think one opportunity, as we touched on in a previous question, is the possibility of partnering transaction. I think particularly with the data that we've released this week, this drug has become eminently partnerable, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to look to a partner to at least partly fund the further development of the drug. So that will be implicit in the conversations that we continue to have with potential partners. And that may fund all or a part of the development, but that's certainly something we'll be pursuing very carefully. Now, clearly, the possibility of further recourse to capital markets remains. I think we're in a very fortunate position now that our company is well funded. We can see through the impact of this coronavirus pandemic, and I think should we need to return to the market at some later date, it will no doubt be in very, very much more favorable circumstances. And then I think the third thing just to recognize is that we do continue to look for non-dilutive funding opportunities, principally grant funding. We have, as we've said publicly, we have an application into the Australian Medical Research Future Fund. A lot of our work in the US has been supported by various external funding sources. So we have some form here, and we're continuing to look at all those opportunities as well to help move the drug forward. And perhaps it's a combination of multiple elements here. So I think it's thankfully not a question we have to answer today, but I think we do have plenty of options in the toolkit to address that as and when we need to.
Okay, thanks, James.
Thank you. Once again, if you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. We will pause momentarily for questions to enter the queue. There are no further questions at this time. I'll now hand back to Dr. Garner for closing remarks.
Thank you, Rachel. I just perhaps address one question that has come up in a number of discussions and hasn't been addressed here, but I thought I might just address preemptively. We've naturally had a number of inquiries about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the operational aspects of our clinical work. And so I think I'd just say this at this stage. We're in a fortunate position in Kazia that our current phase 2 study, the study that we've reported data from today, is fully recruited. We completed recruitment in February, so we're thankfully not in the position of looking for patients, which is very often the first thing that suffers in these sorts of situations. GBM Agile has not yet started recruiting Paxalisib, of course, so that also is unaffected from our point of view. And so in that sense, we're very much that very much limits our exposure to potential disruption. We do see some degree of modest operational impact across our clinical trials, primarily affecting the ability of our personnel to visit hospital sites. But those activities aren't particularly time sensitive. A number of them can be done in a virtual way or a remote way. And so we don't really see anything there at this stage which we anticipate will materially affect timelines or costs or certainly the integrity of our studies. Like every company, we monitor this day by day, but at this stage, I think we're reassured that our work is continuing. Obviously, if that changes, it's something we'll update the market on as we go. But I think, generally speaking, oncology studies are often prioritized in these situations. So, if there are no further questions, I think I'll merely say thank you to the Orient Capital team for administering today's call. Thank you to everybody who has been kind enough to dial in today. This is exciting data for Kazia. This is a big step forward. As I mentioned at the front of the call, this is the first time we've seen a survival signal for our drug, and that is a very important milestone. We'll be looking forward to continuing to move this forward. I think we're in a very strong position now to continue with the clinical work without any interruption or delay, thanks to our recent financing. And we expect there will be a number of further data readouts during the course of calendar 2020, and we'll look forward to discussing those with you all as the year progresses. In the meantime, thank you again for all your support and engagement with the company, and I just wish everybody that they stay safe in obviously unusual circumstances. Thank you all very much.